Out of this war, there has developed the new road to Asia, the Sky Road from Alaska to northernmost Siberia. American Lend-Lease planes to fight the Germans are being flown to the Soviet Air Force along this route in a steady stream. From the great American and Soviet air bases, planes can fly the downhill routes over continuous land surfaces, not only to China, but to India, Iran, and the Near East. Over this route, Vice President Wallace recently flew to China, visiting many centers of Soviet industry and war production on the way. Never before had so important an American representative visited these little-known territories. The Soviet authorities threw everything open to him. Soviet cameramen made a continuous record of the journey, and Office of War Information now presents to you this film made by our Soviet allies about a journey through lands and among peoples destined to be better known to Americans in the years after the war. Flying in from the Bering Straits, the big C-54 lands at Yakutsk, a city about as far north as Fairbanks in Alaska. Here Mr. Wallace is met by Soviet leaders and is greeted by Mr. Vinokurov, chairman of the Council of People's Commissars of the Yakutsk Republic. The Yakuts are an ancient Asiatic people who migrated centuries ago to the far north. Now they have their own republic. The capital, Yakutsk, was founded 300 years ago. One wooden tower is all that now remains of the original stockade. Yakutsk today is both an ancient city and a frontier town, but as in almost every Soviet city, even in the wilderness, there is a library which is one of the centers of intellectual life. Even in the wilderness, close up to the Arctic Circle, Russians never forget the war. Long live our great allies, the United States and Great Britain, says the slogan. And as the Vice President comes into the street again, a crowd of children has gathered. All of us in the party noticed wherever we went how friendly Soviet children are, and not in the least bit shy with strangers. In the country near Yakutsk, Mr. Wallace visited an agricultural station and talked with the experts who are carrying agriculture far up into the north. To them, he was not only Vice President of the United States, but a fellow expert. Even apple trees can be grown in the far north by spreading their branches out almost flat along the ground, so that in winter they can be warmly covered up with fir boughs and earth, and they preserve the apples for use during the winter. The next large center visited is Irkutsk on the Trans-Siberian Railroad, where Mr. Wallace is greeted by Mr. Komissarov, engineer from Leningrad, who is now a pioneer of Siberian industry. Near Irkutsk, the Americans drive out to a state farm. Siberia is a land of big distances and few cities and shopping centers. Each little community is likely to have its own duck pond, just as it raises its own pigs and hens. Experimental work in growing fruit, berries, and vegetables is the specialty of this farm, and each American is quick to notice differences between Siberia and his own home state. Soviet scientists have got good results by starting vegetables in greenhouses and later transplanting them in open fields when the weather gets warm. Tomatoes and cucumbers are especial favorites. Crisp cucumbers, like the one Mr. Wallace is picking and eating, are as characteristic of Siberia as the hot dog is of America. Everywhere in Siberia, the Russians increased the local food supply by improving the breed of pigs and also going in for new breeds of cattle, like the black and white Holsteins, which raise the milk yield, and also the big brown and white Siementhal breed. Red Dawn, the next farm visited, is one of the famous collectives, not merely a farm, but a whole village community. Everybody in the village is a member, and a complicated system of accounting is needed to determine how much a man or woman draws for growing wheat and how much for teaching in the village school. We then visit the village store. One end of it is set aside for selling things to the families of Red Army soldiers at special prices. The American visitors pass from the village store to the village Soviet. A village Soviet in Siberia is a forum for open discussion, like a town meeting in New England. Lake Baikal, easily reached from Irkutsk, is the deepest lake in the world. It must once have been connected with the ocean because in it there live seals, the only freshwater seals in the world. The mountains around the lake are extremely rich in minerals and wildlife. Muskrats from America have been introduced into this region and are now providing a regular fur crop. The river running out of this lake is capable of providing a tremendous head of hydroelectric power. Plans for building the necessary power dam were interrupted by the war. A special scientific station is maintained on the shores of Lake Baikal for studying the natural resources, and during a trip on a tug out on the lake, the scientists explained their work to the Vice President. We then go by plane to the eastern side of Lake Baikal. Mr. Wallace talks with a Russian flyer who has made over 100 landings behind the German lines, carrying supplies to the Soviet guerrillas. We are now in the Buryat Mongolian Republic. These Mongols are cousins of the Mongols of Outer Mongolia, and their language is almost the same. The Buryat Mongols run their own government, and they have succeeded in modernizing the old Mongol nomadic life. Our first visit was to a collectivized ranch, where Mr. Wallace was greeted by members of the ranch committee. The short man with the boyish face is President of the Republic. The Buryats have solved their economic problem by building community centers where they live in the winter. In summer, they live in tents while their cattle graze on the rich pastures. The Americans were surprised to see a Wisconsin-type silo, which the Buryats had selected as the best type to suit their conditions. Cattle of all kinds are the wealth of the Mongols, but horses are their pride and joy, and the ranch owns some fine Russian breeding stock. The Mongols watched keenly to see if the Americans had a good eye for a horse, and were delighted with the Vice President's expert knowledge. This black stallion is the type from which are bred the best Soviet cavalry horses, and Colonel Kite from Texas looks him over. The collective ranch has its own community center, and here the village band, composed mainly of plump Buryat girls and women, play loud, welcoming music for the Vice President. Round-cheeked and round-eyed, the children didn't miss a thing that was going on, while their mothers and sisters played with a will, and the Vice President and the oldest inhabitant looked on. Contrast is never far around the corner in Soviet Russia. Here in this land of horsemen and herders is also one of the biggest locomotive works in Siberia. The head of the works, the tall man in uniform, holds military rank during the war, like many civilian engineers in Russia. This helps in gearing industrial production to war needs. One of the big war jobs of this locomotive works is to recondition rolling stock captured from the Germans. A swing south was next made to the remote little frontier village of Shushenskoye, where Lenin, father of the revolution, lived 3 years in exile. Here Lenin was married, and the village records show that even in exile, Lenin and his wife continued their political work and study. From here, the party returned to the Trans-Siberian Railway by river steamer along the Yenisei River, which is used as a highway to open up the wilderness, much as the Mississippi and Missouri were used in our own pioneer days. The Yenisei flows from the heart of Asia all the way to the Arctic Ocean. Traveling by air again, Mr. Wallace and his party visit Novossibirsk, one of the great and vigorous new Siberian cities and home of many war industries evacuated from Western Russia to escape the German invasion. Cities in Siberia have their own individuality, just as they do in America. There is no mistaking the personality of Novossibirsk, a personality of, let's get it done and do it right. One of the flourishing industries here is the making of the famous Yak fighter planes, one of the standard Soviet planes which has borne the brunt of the air war against the Germans. The American flyers in Vice President Wallace's party found this a very serviceable plane, not quite as polished in workmanship as American products, but a maneuverable and tough little plane that can both take it and dish it out. The Yak plane is especially notable for the speed of its cannon fire. Novossibirsk has one of the biggest opera buildings in the world, and here Vice President Wallace made an address at a public meeting. He read his address in Russian, a gesture warmly appreciated, because the Russians, like anybody else, feel complimented when a stranger takes the trouble to learn their own language in order to speak to them.
Меня очень обрадовало. Его название весьма знаменательно. К понятию о Сибири присоединено нечто новое. Для каждого американца.
From here, the journey swung far south to Kazakhstan, a vast republic extending from the Chinese frontier to the Caspian Sea. Breeders of horses, cattle, sheep, and camels, the Kazakhs are descendants of ancient warriors and speak a dialect of the Turkish language. Instead of the lasso, the Kazakh horsemen use a pole with a running noose on it, and they can cut a horse out of the herd and lasso it as deftly as a cowboy. The vast herds of the Kazakhs furnish thousands of cavalry mounts to the Red Army. Living is easy in the summer, and the nomads love to visit each other and to drink fermented mare's milk, which has a sour taste and is about as strong as beer. These people of Central Asia also make their own kind of donut, which is cooked just like ours, but doesn't have a hole in the middle. The Kazakhs never walk if they can ride, and even when it comes to American cigarettes, their motto is that they will ride a mile to get one. Here the horsemen are trying king-size cigarettes for the first time, while the women make tea in the open using a Russian samovar. Right in the middle of the Kazakh deserts and grazing lands, new industries are arising. One of them is the coal mining district of Karaganda, with a modern city notable for its striking architecture. Here, in addition to mining coal in the ordinary way, are some of the biggest open-cut coal pits in the world. The surface of the earth is scooped off with bulldozers, and this reveals huge veins of coal. Tracks are laid and trains steam right into the solid coal, where steam shovels have opened up wide cuts. Many of the trains and much of the machinery are operated by women, who have taken over about a third of all the work in Soviet industry in order to free more men for the front. Both Soviet engineers and Soviet workers think highly of the American equipment, much of it obtained on Lend-Lease, which are used in these mines and other industries. The Kazakhs themselves are rapidly entering industry and learning from the Russians how to operate every kind of machinery. Also in the Kazakh Republic is the great open copper mine of Kongrat, which might well be called the Soviet Anaconda. The processes used are much like those used in the Anaconda mine, and the quality of the copper ore is almost exactly the same. Near this mine there has grown up a whole city in what only a few years ago was almost uninhabited desert, where the only means of travel was by camel. Still farther to the south lies Tachkent, the most distant point reached by Vice-President Wallace. Here a modern city of 1 million inhabitants has grown up in the heart of the ancient civilization of the Uzbeks, a Turkish-speaking people of Soviet Central Asia. The climate here rivals that of Southern California. It almost never rains, and the palatial buildings of the modern city gleam white and clean in the sunny air. At Tashkent, capital of the Uzbek Republic, there took place an interesting diplomatic meeting between the Vice President and Mr. Harriman, ambassador to Moscow. From Moscow also came an old friend of the Vice President, Mr. Quintanilla, Mexican ambassador to Moscow. They greeted each other with true Latin fervor. Notice that the Vice President is wearing a cap of the kind that nearly everybody in Central Asia wears. In the old days, they say that you could tell exactly what district a man came from by the kind of embroidery on his cap. Mr. Wallace also spent some time in consultation with the Chinese ambassador, whose country he was to visit within a few days. They also found time to try out the use of an American-made push hoe, which Mr. Wallace brought with him. After experiments in a number of places, it was found that this type of hoe was best adapted for use in the dry soil of northwest China. The Uzbek Republic is famed for its beautiful cotton, produced by crossing the best American cotton with a local Central Asian type. The cotton is entirely dependent on irrigation water coming from distant snow-capped mountains. The hotter the summer gets and the more water is needed, the more water comes down the irrigation channels from snow melting on the high mountains. Mr. Wallace and the Mexican ambassador are especially interested to find Mexican wild cotton growing on the Soviet experimental farm. Another similarity between the Uzbek Republic and California is the wine industry. In Central Asia, the people love to picnic under the grape arbors, and the Vice President and the visiting diplomats from Moscow were lavishly entertained with the wonderful fruit grown by the hospitable Uzbek farmers, whose villages they went to visit. The last stop in Soviet territory was made at Alma Atta, a city standing on desert land at the foot of snow-covered mountains. Alma Ata may become the Hollywood of the Soviet Union. During the war, the Soviet film industry has taken advantage of the high average of sunny days at Alma Ata and may settle there permanently. Meet the crew, veterans of thousands of miles flown all over the world during this war. Sergeant Robitaille from Maine, Sergeant Cooper, formerly of Scotland and now an American. Like most Air Force men who have served in China, he wears a jacket with an American flag sewn on it. Sergeant Minkoff works on the landing gear with Sergeant Barrett, the radio operator. Sergeant Minkoff comes from Philadelphia but speaks fluent Russian. Colonel Chulkov consults about the flight across the Soviet frontier with Lieutenant Golkowski of Connecticut, co-pilot, and Captain John Wagner of Indiana, navigator. And here's Colonel Kite, pilot of the good plane Polar Bear. The plane is all ready for the long hop into Chinese territory on the way to Chongqing, and as a last touch, the crew turns the props to distribute the oil pressure evenly. The Vice President steps to the door of the plane to bid goodbye to his Soviet hosts, and as a parting gesture puts on the Uzbek cap, which had been presented to him at Tashkent. And so continuing this pioneer journey of the airways, linking together Alaska, Siberia, Central Asia, and China, the mighty C-54 warms up, turns down the runway, and heads for the snow-capped mountains and the distant capital of our ally, China.